Cutting trails has always been a big part of making my recreational property a fun place. When I first started, I didn't find much in the way of resources, so in this video, I'm hoping to share what I've learned along the way.
So this is the first set of tools I used out on the property to make trails. It mostly consists of things I already owned and had in my garage. I start with some protective boots and gloves. I also have a bush axe that my father-in-law sent me as a gift. I've got a couple of versions of machetes that I ended up going through, and of course I've got a bow saw here. These tools are very useful, but they're not powered. There's no gas power, there's an electrical power, and using human power you get tired pretty quickly. So I learned my lesson even after a few weeks that I needed to upgrade from here. So the bush axe is a pretty useful tool, but it kind of covers an in-between area. Obviously you're not going to cut a tree down like this, and for real fine vines like this, it's a little bit more difficult to use the bush axe than it would be a machete. The bush axe works really well for kind of mid-sized trees like this that are kind of pain in the butt to hack with a machete, but it's not worth using an axe. So the machete does work well for smaller vines. For example, something like this, one quick swipe, and you've gone through them. So you can cut a quarter-inch, half-inch tree like this. Sometimes it takes a couple of swipes and you have to swing pretty hard. So a tree like this, where you want to cut it way down at the base to get it out of the way, works pretty well with a bush axe. And so this is how the bush axe works with these kind of mid-sized trees.
As useful as a bow saw is, after about your 100th tree, you start to realize they're just not quite the same thing as a chainsaw, especially when you get into trees with larger diameter.
So after realizing that using hand tools wasn't going to work to cut trails on 20 acres worth of property, I added some power tools and a pair of handheld loppers. The loppers are nice because they allow you to cut through about a half-inch, quarter-inch branch with one chop. I also added this hedge trimmer. My original one was electric and it worked okay, but I ended up burning it out. This one is a gas-powered version that my brother gave me, and it works pretty well for vines that you would typically cut with a machete. I also added a sawzall, and that's because I had it already in my garage. This allowed me to cut the trees that I was cutting previously with that bow saw with a little bit more ease, but it didn't get me much beyond a couple of inches in diameter. So next up to my kit of tools, I added this bush blade, which is functionally a string trimmer and a saw blade added to the end of it. This works really well because you can cut 1 to 1.5 inch trees, and you can also clear a lot of vines. The blade has carbide tips, which allow it to last for a really long time. To attach it, you have to buy a special kit that goes on the bottom. This thing replaces the cartridge that usually dispenses the string that's on the bottom of this.
The bush blade is probably my most used tool when making trails. You use it in one of two ways, by either taking long, sweeping swings to cut small stuff, or sawing against larger diameter trees and eventually cutting them down. It also works really well against heavy vine and reeds, but it doesn't do much against standard grass.
Finally, I added chainsaws to my tool set. I started with a gas saw that my brother gave me, but it was pretty worn out and eventually broke down. While I was in the repair shop, I bought an electric saw just as kind of a bridge. It works pretty well, but I recently purchased a decent Echo saw, which is a whole world different. In addition to the saws, of course, you have to add all the proper protective equipment.
I use the chainsaw as sparingly as possible because I want to preserve as many trees as I can. Also, it's a lot of work to deal with the aftermath and all the extra wood.
So in the end, I get most of my work done with the tools I'm showing you here, my bush blade and my chainsaw. I do carry a variety of other tools with me that I keep on the four-wheeler for some specific circumstances. So this is my full setup I typically use when cutting trails. I've got my ATV loaded up. I've got my bush blade here, got my bush axe and a machete, I've also got a grabber and a bucket to throw trash in that I find as I go along. I used to keep all my tools stacked on the four-wheeler, and I used a carry-all that attached to the hitch behind it. I recently purchased this little trailer that allows me to put the tools off of the four-wheeler and detach it when I'm not using them. So in my trailer, I've got a bunch of different tools. Things like my 2-cycle gas, chainsaw bar oil, extension cords, my protective equipment, obviously my chainsaw, and I also carry around a generator when I'm using electric tools. I know there's a lot of stuff in here, but I'm going to put a list underneath the description of this video of the tools that I typically use when cutting trails to make it a little bit easier. So when starting a trail, especially with growth this thick, I found that it makes sense to cut a single person wide trail or single track. That way you can kind of figure out which way you're going, and if you make a mistake, you haven't totally committed with a really wide path. Eventually, you'll start building up some debris, and you got to drag it out of your way before you can make any more progress forward. I can tell that my trail is going a little bit too far to the right, but because I've kept it small, I can shift it left pretty easily without a lot of wasted work. So I'm starting to get bogged down by a lot of vines and bramble at chest and head height that I can't cut with the bush blade. So I'm using my hedge trimmer to make a hole and continue with my progress. Now that I have this trail about single track wide, I'm going to go back and take a second pass and open it to about the width of my four-wheeler so I can bring some extra tools down with me. When cutting trails, obviously it's easier just to go around trees, but sometimes the tree is just right in the middle of where you need to be. Because these trails are walking paths, I want to cut the tree down as close to the ground as possible, but that's pretty difficult when you've got the entirety of the tree above you. So what I've found is if I cut the tree at a neutral level and get rid of the bulk of it, then I can concentrate on getting a close cut to the ground. Now that this short segment of trail is done, to maintain it, you can cut it every season with a mower or a bush hog. You can also keep it open with regular use by walking on the trail or riding over it with an ATV.